All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining the first of 2021's evolve.ag online virtual chats. My name is Wendy Yared. I'm a food anthropologist and I'm the founder of evolve.ag. And I just want to welcome everybody and thank you so much, Benjamin Lorr, for participating in this conversation with me. I'm really, really excited. I absolutely loved your book, The Secret Life of Groceries, and I'm really excited that we get to talk about it with a bunch of folks today. So thanks everybody for tuning in. A couple housekeeping things, please stay muted. If there's a burning question that you have while we're going through, feel free to write it in the chat and then we'll go ahead and try to fit it in if we have time. Otherwise, we'll do some Q&A at the end. I'll leave about 10 minutes or so at the end for any other questions that you might have. So yeah, thanks again. And thanks so much, Ben, for participating in this.
Total pleasure.
So just a little bit of background. Last year, probably in the fall sometime, I had 2 or 3 people tell me about The Secret Life of Groceries. They were like, you have to read this book, you have to read this book. So after the third person mentioned it to me in 1 week, I was like, okay, I'm gonna download this book and read it. And I just couldn't put it down. I thought it was fascinating. As somebody who knows a lot about the food industry, this was a whole other window into a world that I had no idea existed. And so I just wanna thank you for publishing such an innovative book. It's clear you did a ton of research and a ton of like underground research even. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. The other topics that I want to talk about is identity in food. So as a food anthropologist, that's something I think about and talk about all the time. And you definitely have dove deep into that in this book and also in other recent articles that you've been putting out. So we'll definitely chat a little bit about that. And then the other thing I want to talk about is COVID and how the food supply chain has really changed because of COVID. I think all of us are used to seeing, on social media, pictures of parties and pictures of people having fun. And over the past year, that shifted to people, sharing sourdough recipes or, beans and rice or other things that they were making at home all of a sudden. So I think not only has the culture of food shifted a little bit, a lot of our favorite restaurants have closed. We've heard a lot of stories from frontline workers in the food industry. But also, availability of food has changed too. We all went through that time when there was a ton of panic shopping and all of a sudden things weren't available anymore. And all of that is based upon this food supply chain, which Benjamin really took a deep dive into in The Secret Life of Groceries. So we're going to talk about all of these topics. And like I said, there will be a little bit of time at the end for any questions. So yeah, let's get started. So before we do anything, Benjamin, could you just introduce yourself?
Sure. Benjamin Lorr, writer. And I guess as way of introduction for this book, I can tell you a little bit, assuming you haven't read this or anything else I've written. I walk into things very much as an outsider, very much as someone who's exploring terrain with new eyes and just trying to gather a lot of different competing voices on one level, reaching out to everyone, asking them, who can you put me in touch with that'll let me learn a little more? On another level, trying to get as close to the lived experience of people in the field, whether that's by shadowing them or, in this book, I work alongside them. And that's not to give me a false sense of expertise, but just so I can color the book with, I think, a little more detail that only comes from one-on-one experience. And I take my time. Writing for me is not a full-time gig, so I don't have the pressure to publish a book a year. And so for this book, I spent about 5 years stalking the grocery world. For my last book, which was on the Bikram yoga community, and broke the news that like Bikram Choudhury, the guru, was kind of a sexual predator, kind of pre-Me Too story. I spent about a year just doing that yoga, even in preparation for the book, and just so I could get kind of cred with that world to ask them the questions I wanted to ask. And so that's my approach. As for why the grocery world, I mean, there's a really direct linear relationship in my mind between the yoga book and the grocery book. That one was looking at kind of obsessive desire in fitness, and this I looked at, for me, was rooted at first in like how the grocery store had changed over my lifetime, and the way it had become something had transformed from a chore into a place that people were obviously getting a lot of meaning out of through their choices. But also, I'm just someone who's always liked the grocery store. I go on vacation, I go to the grocery store and just kind of pal around there and see what there's to be seen.
I do that too. I think my husband thinks I'm crazy. I'm like, I have to see what this grocery store in Thailand looks like.
Yeah, it's
Or with this
definitely one
market.
of those things that splits people. There are people who look at you like you're mad, but I don't know. I like it. It's
That's
a
great.
surreal place when you walk. It's got all of these like it's both like extremely comforting for me with that kind of like um, array of choices, and also there is something almost threatening or scary about like the banks of options and like the like looming, like you can just feel all the power, or I can feel a lot of power in a grocery store, and I'm like, oh, this is all arrayed here for me, and just wanted to scratch the surface of that, I guess.
It's amazing. And your research was extensive. I mean, you went into slaughterhouses, you worked at Whole Foods, you went to conferences and the fancy food show and a farm. So you rode in trucks, which I'm really excited to talk about in a little while for sure. But before we get into this, I wanted just to kick off the discussion with some of the facts that you had mentioned in the book about buying food in America, because I think these were pretty mind blowing. In 2018, Americans spent $701 billion at supermarket style grocery stores, which is still our largest food expenditure as a country by a wide margin. There are over 38,000 of these stores across the land, and the average adult will spend 2% of their life inside one, which that statistic really caught me off guard. We only spend 10% of our budget on food, compared to 40% by our great grandparents in 1900 and 30% by our grandparents in the 50s. Around the War of 1812, nearly 90% of the population, 90% of the population worked to produce the food for this nation. It was a grueling life, and in addition to being costly, the food produced was of uneven quality, in tightly limited supply, and could and often did kill through disease. Now, now less than 3% of our population produces enough food to feed us all. So those are just kind of some mind-blowing statistics that were in the book. One of the concepts that you kind of started the book off with was this idea of how the food industry and the supply chain transform animals and vegetables into a product. And basically there's a transition somewhere from when the plant or animal is alive and well and then ceases to be and then becomes food and is no longer this animal anymore, but is instead part of like a consumer packaged good. Can you talk a little bit about that transition from animal or plant to food? Like, where does the line get crossed?
Yeah, it's an animal from and plant to food, and then from food into product. And really, this was all just listening, especially the latter half, was just listening to grocery managers, workers talk, and the way they would kind of code shift between talking to customers and talking among themselves. And you would hear them talking like rich food terms when they're across the counter, and then suddenly it just swings right into product this, product that, stack it up, stack it high. And of course, there are reasons for it, but I became really interested in that, the way that the language shapes our ideas about things, and the idea of food, something moving from like a natural animal state to food. Was early on in the book, I talked to this slaughter plant supervisor, a guy who had self-described as being on the scene for the slaughter of 800 million chickens, and it's kind of like macho food ag guy, and he got really impassioned by talking about the moment in the slaughter plant when the chicken would go from kind of bloody, still, at this point it had been like, it's carotid artery had been slit, but it was, it was still kind of kicking and dirty and feathered. And then it goes through this machine that blasts it with hot water, and the feathers fall off, and it enters a new part of the slaughterhouse, which is, almost entirely bloodless. There's no more evidence of the feather, and he was just like, this is the moment that it becomes food. And I thought that there was something really really essential in understanding that progression, that it changed the way he approached the whole business of the slaughterhouse. So I think it only becomes food again when you take it off the shelf and you put it in your mouth, or you start conceiving about eating it, and then it suddenly has all these qualities that become much more personal, much more individual, and that they're much more ego driven, I guess, instead of like its qualities on the market and its place in terms of like a network of goods and something that will spoil if it's not sold quick enough.
That makes sense. That's really fascinating. And I think this kind of walks back into the original idea I was also saying that we talked about today about identity and food, and how, yeah, there's all these consumer packaged goods on the shelf, and a lot of them are labeled, vegan or grass fed or 100% fair trade. And there's all these different, notations ascribed and labels put on these foods. And we tend to buy these things that we identify with, right? So, people who buy all organic or try to buy local, like part of their identity is wrapped around the fact that, we spend extra money, or we specifically purchase food at this store because we know that, we agree with their ethos or whatnot. I'd love to hear your opinion on this intersection between food and identity and culture, really, and how that all kind of maps together for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think on one level it's very straightforward. Food is this another material object that we use as a bridge to meaning, and our food contains. Grant McCracken talks about food being, or not food, but material possessions being a place for displaced ideals. So these ideals that we have that are so important to us that we can't kind of bear their presence in the real world, because they're ideals and they don't stand up well in the real world. But if we displace them slightly to a place where they might be safe by putting them in a historical figure or a different time period or a material object, then those ideals can live on. And you just see this everywhere in the grocery store and our food buying decisions when you start looking for it. Obviously in the supplement aisle and all of these kind of Ayurvedic to organic, like amulet potions and pills that people are kind of channeling. And full disclosure, I use a lot of these things, so I'm not talking entirely scornfully here. But it's interesting in itself. I also think food as a material object is like a very particular type of material object that allows us to kind of run free, especially those of us who came up with like a skeptical image around materialism and consumption, right? It's something you're forced to do. It's a necessary biological process, and it vanishes. You once you've eaten, it's gone, and you kind of have to do it all over again. So it provides a kind of comfortable way of indulging these consumptive rituals and material, like our interface with material objects, that like doing something with a Rolex or like kind of crass materialism, a lot of people would never indulge in it like that. And it is also, it's very intellectual. There's all these, it's all bound up in the ideas around food and the knowledge that you gain through cooking podcasts or Mark Bittman's like advice. So all the same hierarchies, I guess, are there in food, but they're just more hidden. And I think that was kind of an unconscious discovery people made over my lifetime, I think, where it was like, oh, we can get a lot out of food in terms of it being a material object. We don't just have to have like one type of pasta. We can have 15 types of pasta that will speak to whether or not our colon biota is unique to us in some way, or whether or not we care for the world properly, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, it's interesting how brands use so much storytelling to really get people to buy their product. And I think that's another thing you talked about in this book, is actually you debunked a lot of these labels that were put on things and regulations that are, I shouldn't say corrupt, but somewhat corrupt, right? There's a lot of corruption in how these labels are applied and who's regulating them and then who's auditing the regulators. Can you talk a little bit about that? And maybe, I mean, we're all probably going to cry after this conversation about all the things that we thought we bought all these years that was so good for the earth and for people and things like that. But I think it's also really important to get down to the meat of it and just know that, you know, there is a lot of corruption and what do we do, right?
Yeah, it's a soft corruption, and I don't know that it should be totally demoralizing, or at least that wasn't the spirit that I wanted to channel with the book. They're like, this is a hopeless system. You shouldn't buy these products. I think it is important to recognize their fragility, the way they are actively abused by the industry, and the way that they can hamper real reform. But that's not necessarily also to say that they are themselves bad, or that by buying organic you're not doing some small thing good. But you might be appeasing more of yourself than you are actually leading a revolution in terms of making the world a better place. At least that's the conclusion I came to after looking at how these certification regimes were set up. So food is certified almost exclusively, although that is this is somewhat changing, based on audits. The audit regime is what it's called. And, you know, honestly, there's a direct correlation between the audit regime in food and the audit regime that in financial audits that caused the 2008 financial crisis, meaning that the audits are a snapshot look at a place. They don't have any enforcement power whatsoever. They are for profit, so they're hired by the manufacturer for the sole purpose that they're required for indemnity purposes by the supermarket buyer. And it's a for-profit system so that you can shop around for the auditor of your choice and get somebody who will, you know, both be rigorous but also get you a passing grade. And I think more to the fact, in terms of like the analogy with financial audits, they're exceedingly opaque. I mean, I wish I had a slide that I could just show you with like the certifiers of certifiers of certifiers regimes and the language that it's written in. I would stare at this stuff. I read, I consider myself a capable reader, and just be completely befuddled by what was going on. And then I would talk to people who studied, you know, professors who were studying this, and have them try to unpack it with me. And they, you know, it was clearly a conscious opacity. You were not supposed to understand as an outsider exactly how the certifiers of certifiers were certifying things and the different categories that were going into it, because they weren't meant to be looked in at that depth. What they were meant to do was indemnify a buyer and push all legal responsibility onto the manufacturer and make the consumer feel better about this purchase. You know, in terms of actually, both in terms of food safety and especially for intangible things like ethical qualities, withheld pay stubs, the lack of enforcement and the snapshot approach and the global nature of food, and the fact that auditors are often not located in the places that they're auditing, just make it a kind of bizarre system for trying to actually bring trust into the system. And I think that's the last thing I would say. I know I'm talking a lot, but like when you think about the audit system, the whole point of it is to increase your trust as a consumer. But in reality, I think it, just like airport security or any theatrical way of like showing trust, it actually operates on you as a consumer to create a lot more doubt in the system. And so you get to this point where the certification regime builds on itself. So it started off as just single audits. And then of course people wanted the auditors themselves audited. And now there's global regimes that audit the auditors. And it just becomes this system of oversight that on both sides is so compliance oriented. You know, if you're a manufacturer, you're kind of ducking in this cat and mouse game. And if you're a consumer, you're never totally sure if like, why does this need an audit to begin with? That just ends up stripping trust from the system.
Wow. Well, thank you for that answer. I know, for example, a lot of times with organic, a lot of farms can't pay for the certification for organic. So they say, if you talk to a farmer or if you read about the farm online, if they have an online website by this point in time, a lot of them will say, we don't use any pesticides, but we can't actually get the organic
Mm.
certification, but we still have it. So it kind of, they know that this certification is important to people, but they give an explanation behind why they don't have it. Do you think there's any kind of similar application for things like fair trade, or I don't know, any of these other like things that you've seen that have been audited, like audits gone wrong, that can give us some hope or some confidence in what we're buying is actually what it says it is?
Well, I think the route out of this is to figure out how to make connections. And this is not an easy route out, and I don't know that this is a solution, but the more you can make direct connections with people that you have a reason to trust them beyond compliance motivated thinking. Either you just know them, or you get it you have that intangible feeling of trust from dealing with them one on one, like through CSAs and direct purchasing from farmers. I think that's a natural way to restore trust. In terms of the idea that smallholders who can afford to play in the fair trade system would be more ethical, I think that's a pretty dangerous idea, because if anything, the smallholders are the most crushed by global market price competition, and they're often the most struggling. I mean, on one level, they're the least able to pay bribes to auditors. So when they are audited, they're probably, um, on the up and up there. But I guess I don't think that small necessarily implies any level of ethics that isn't in big. In fact, what I saw in Thailand when shrimp and the seafood supply chain in Thailand is extremely decentralized. Tens of thousands of smallholder boats, kind of like family farms, but they're fishermen, and a lot of the worst abuses that you would see in the supply chain happen there, because when you have so many small holders, it's even harder to have any oversight over them, and they're even more desperate.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. I think, one of the things that's come out of COVID is actually a lot more people are going directly to the farms to at least get local produce, eggs, milk, things like that. So perhaps that's one solution that kind of came out of this crisis, is just showing people, hey, there actually is, someone at the end of the supply chain that you can get a hold of to talk to and learn more about your food and where it's coming from and things like that. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the trucking industry, because I think that was definitely one of the more moving and personal and really adventurous sections of the book that you wrote about. You talked about a lot about a woman named Lynn and spent a lot of time with her. And before we get into her story, I just want to give a couple of facts to the audience, because I also thought these facts were just fascinating. And, as someone who studied food in America for a long time, I had no idea about the capacity of our food supply chain from a trucking industry. So here's just a couple things that I wanted to note. There are 10.7 billion tons of freight per year getting moved around America on trucks. That breaks down 54 million tons a day. 54 million tons a day, which equals out to 350 pounds per person per day in America of freight being moved around. And then on top of that, I don't even want to think about how much of that freight is waste, cardboard boxes, plastic, bubble wrap, things like that. That's a topic for another day. And then trucking is the most common form of employment in the majority of American states, with more than 12.6 million commercial drivers circulating our highways. Moving freight from California to DC takes 7 to 10 days on rails, but the truck driving the same freight can shrink that to 2.5 days while offering door-to-door precision. And then a couple of facts and figures about food itself. This also, you might want to mute if you're really into buying produce, because when I read these things, I just was like, oh, so sad. But anyways, it's really good stuff to know. Just so, we start to think more locally, I think. But right now, when you buy an apple from the grocery store, it has typically been sitting in dormancy for close to a year. And red cherries, the epitome of summer freshness, might have been stabilized for 2.5 months. There are exceptions, of course, to this. Even in perfect conditions, most leafy greens deteriorate in just under 3 weeks. And anyways, there's a lot of other details I could give you, but you have to read the book to get the rest of those facts. But basically, all these numbers really make me hope that things like vertical farming and other more local and sustainable ways of agriculture really start to take off and become more popular. But until this, we rely on the food supply chain. And Benjamin spent a ton of time speaking with Lynn and traveling with Lynn, who was a truck driver. And I'd just love to hear a little bit about that experience. I know I learned a ton just about the trucking industry again in this chapter, and especially about how, you know, truckers have really low pay, they get accrued debt very easily. Recruiters often go to homeless shelters to recruit truck drivers. And basically it seems like they just get stuck in this cycle of, you know, debt and with a pretty terrible life condition. So Benjamin, would you mind speaking a little bit about that and your experience with Lynn?
Totally. Trucking was probably the most eye-opening part of the book for me. But I do want to the one thing I do want to speak in defense of food dormancy and preservation techniques, because it's just a mixed bag in the sense that some of these technologies are pretty incredible, and food preservation and expanding logistics is also an equity issue in terms of like food spoils, and if we can you can preserve it in ways that maintain flavor, and you know, it's never going to be as perfect. That's gonna really expand the reach of food. It's going to really forestall waste in food waste, and you know, some of the technology is getting really good, especially with like meats and fresh juices. You know, I was talking to a bartender, Jim Meehan, who started like PDT, and he was talking about how like back in the day, like the canned orange juice was kind of like the thing, and canned lemon juice that's what started the whole craft revolution. Like you couldn't possibly make things as fresh and tasty as a fresh lemon, but now there's all these preserved goods that are fresher than you could ever get at the store because of the distance between the place and supply, like fish that's frozen right on the boat, or tinned and preserved in ways. So I don't want people to get totally misled by the numbers that can make you feel like, this is an insane system. It is insane, it's mind-blowing, but it's not necessarily evil.
I appreciate that. Makes us all feel a little bit better.
Yeah. Now to circle back to trucking, which I would say is both insane and evil, or at least the slice of trucking that I saw. So yeah, I guess I, and maybe many of you out there, walked into this book with the impression of trucking as a vaguely middle-class profession, kind of held over from the 70s, and like movies like BJ and the Bear and Breaker Breaker and Smokey and the Bandit, and this kind of gruff but lovable outlaw who spent some time in the truck and got to drive around and was kind of master of their own lifestyle, a freelancer in the best sense of the word. And that's really just not true anymore. So trucking was deregulated by Carter, and then even more by Reagan, in a way that very consciously turned the trucker himself into a commodity, and pretty much rendered trucking like the trucker like a disposable part in the game. Right now, it's a job that truckers, you know, would self-describe as sharecroppers on wheels. They would be caught in a system. First of all, like big picture, trucking has about 90 to 110% turnover per year, which put that in perspective. So a minimum wage job like McDonald's has around that same type of turnover, which again lets you see how wages have kind of fallen in the trucking industry. But to fill that turnover, they recruit with, you know, kind of misleading claims, and then attach truckers to a large amount of debt, because it takes a commercial driver's license, and it takes a considerable amount of training once you've gotten your commercial driver's license. Just passing the test and getting your license doesn't mean you can drive something that's 85,000 pounds, and is one of the most dangerous professions out there. Certainly the most people die per year in trucking of any industry out there. So you get your trucking license, you still need to be trained, and you take often, because you're coming from another minimum wage job, or, you know, I would hear stories writing the book from truckers and from trucking lawyers of people, recruiters who would recruit out of homeless shelters and soup kitchens, recruit returning vets as they would come back. You immediately take on a load of debt to the trucking carrier, who either directly or usually through kind of like a satellite shadow corporation will be running these training programs. And that immediately strips you off of the kind of like free market deregulated trucker, and makes you beholden to a single place, which can then chip away at your paycheck. And the effects are just, you know, devastating. The woman I rode around with was grossing about $120,000 a year. She was taking home $17,000. The week I was with her, her paycheck was $100, exclusively due to deductions taken out of her check before she got it. And, you know, she was essentially homeless because the truck was her, you sleep and live in your cab. So she didn't have a tremendous amount of maneuverability to get out. And she certainly didn't have savings to get out. And that picture, you know, I don't have the empirical evidence. Trucking is such a vast industry. But that was, I don't think, I didn't choose her because she was a sob story. I chose her because I thought she was pretty representative of the world of trucking. And, you know, since the book came out, a number of places have kind of like re-reported that section and obviously found different truckers. And their conclusions have been pretty much the same.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating look into her life, what you described in the book, between, you know, how she lives in this cab basically with her two dogs, and they're her entire life, you know, and if just one little thing goes wrong timing wise, it can screw up the rest of her, you know, day, week, month, just based on the timing of, you know, if they don't let her into the parking lot of the grocery store to unload at a certain time, and sometimes unloading takes forever. There's just all these calculations and things that really contribute to, you know, her life, much less like the food getting from the truck to the grocery store. And just, you know, how careful she is driving, and just all the trials and tribulations she goes through.
Yeah, and I really think, you know, I love that section. I wrote it, so maybe that's not the right way to say it, but it puts a real human face on what I think is like a central dilemma in the book, which is like the face of deregulation. And the fact is, like, truckers like Lynn have reduced the cost of freight for sure, and reduced the cost of grocery for sure. There's no argument, like, consumers are better off for her and for the deregulated industry. And all in general, like, US policy has been to kind of deify the consumer in that way, and do everything possible to get low prices for consumers under the assumption that that's going to make a good life. But it's just so obvious, you know, we're not just consumers, we're also employees. And that section really just shows that dichotomy, and the way that, you know, it's just being taken out of that side of her as you know, the dignified life that she could be living is it's just not there.
Yeah, just incredible. I think one of the things that I've read more recently, I think you put it out in that article last Friday that came out on NBC News, was that, you know, the grocery industry ends up settled on just a few primal things, right? Convenience, high quality, and low prices. And one of the main things that contributes to all of this is how efficient the truck drivers are, and, you know, how much of a flow that they get into from start to finish. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I mean, I think that's a really hard, you know, 3-point diagram to really get right, and to make efficient. And they're doing this almost in an exploitative way with a lot of truckers.
Oh yeah. I mean, in general, you know, those three values, convenience, price, high quality, are in tension. You can't, it's really hard to get high quality and low price. And when consumers are demanding that, something's got to give. And when you look at commodity structures, and like I said, the deregulation essentially has made trucking a commodity industry, but this is true for all of them, certainly true for shrimp. When you get something to a commodity, you have a lot of fixed costs to go play the commodity game and get into the commodity market. The one thing that you have leverage with if you're a manufacturer is labor. It's the one cost that you can go to again and again and figure out more schemes to like make your workers more and more efficient. And now with globalized labor, this gets turned into like literal human rights violations where you just outsource it to places where you know, you can do actual abusive things. And that's what I saw in Thailand and what you see in India and the Philippines now as those practices have moved on. But it's also true domestically, you know, you just strip the dignity out of people's work by making it more and more efficient and whittling them down into finer and finer points.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, you were talking about how most female truckers had been abused on the job. Like almost every single one you talked to, or almost every single one in the industry had reported that. And that to me was also another just huge red flag. Like, oh my gosh, this is such a crazy industry that's exploiting people that, you know, who's ever heard of that story before? This is like the first time I've heard of, you know, this particular industry being so bad for women. And, you know, for 90% of them to report that, that's just an incredible statistic.
Oh, it's a devastating. I mean, so good to go back. So as entering trucker, you get your CDL, then you have to train with someone because you can't drive a truck by yourself. So you go on the road with your co-driver, who's your supervisor, because it's a training, and they are basically the sole eyes responsible for whether or not you graduate into being a trucker of your own. And you're living in a cab with them. You're living in this like 8x8 box for weeks at a time. And, you know, now the industry more and more is trying to pair female truckers with female truckers, but that is not a standard practice. It certainly wasn't the norm for when I was writing the book. And so you get partnered with some guy who's living in your box, responsible for judging your performance. It's just like such an obvious place for abuse. And again, this is a place like I couldn't make an empirical case because I didn't have the resources to do some vast analysis on the trucking industry. But one, yes, every woman I spoke to had a story of being abused themselves firsthand or knew someone who had been. And two, when official resources have looked into it, like the stories come pouring out. So it's something that I feel pretty safe in saying. And I will say also, you know, I wanted to ride around with a female trucker because I wanted to highlight that aspect of it. But in general, the trucker is so enormously vulnerable, male or female, in those situations. It's a very macho culture, and you're out on your own in the middle of nowhere, like on I-80. And so I guess the female trucker, you know, all those vulnerabilities are amplified more, but there really are a lot of non-gendered abuse in that industry too.
That makes sense. What is the solution to a less exploitative system, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I come to in the book is that the solution is not thinking about this as an agricultural and thinking about it in terms of diet, but thinking about policies that come outside of that framework, which at this point you guys are probably all nodding your head and saying duh. But you know, strengthening worker rights and creating paths for advocacy, bringing back labor unions. You know, we haven't really touched on the international aspect of this, but globalized trade policies with enforcement mechanisms. You know, these things, like if you globalize labor, you also have to globalize standards, and you also have to globalize enforcement, because these are police actions that are, you know, in the international scene, you know, criminal actions are happening, audits and the supermarket are just not the systems that are ever going to be able to respond. To think that Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, or Aldi's would somehow be able to root out people who are holding other people in bondage, it's like, that's not totally, like, the more I started grappling with it, that's not totally rational thinking. They're not equipped to reform a supply chain. These are like deep and criminal actors who are involved in these places. and simply cutting off buy from the supply chain, when you understand the scale of it and the way, again, you have lots of small holders that mixes good actors in with bad actors, often doesn't have the effects that you want it to, even though morally it might feel really nice. And I'm not saying as a consumer you should take whatever action makes you feel comfortable, but as a systematic way of responding to these problems, it lacks. I think the more that we can create worker-owned cooperatives that will get away from this race to the bottom where labor is almost always the cost to be cut, is something that I've become really interested in. But yeah, I don't have a ton of good solutions. I'm sorry that I wanted to have a lot, but I also didn't want to write things that would just make everyone feel great about global capitalism, when I don't know if that's the case.
No, that makes total sense. And I think the one thing that you really said in the book is like, most of the people participating in the food and agriculture industry, these are all really good people. There's not a bunch of people working in these places and in these systems that go to work every day saying, oh, I can't wait to exploit somebody, or I can't wait to, lower someone's pay. Like, for the most part, this is an industry of really humble, passionate people. But yeah, as like an overarching regulation side of it, that's kind of where things get a little murky, seems like.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think the paradigm I had in my head when I walked into the book was like, yeah, there are these greedy multinational profit-driven faceless companies that are like pillaging our food system. And that exists to some extent in certain sections of the industry. But for the most part in grocery, the margins are so low and it's driven entirely on serving consumer demand. And the problems come from a rapacious competition to serve other people and serve consumer demands, and realizing that if you don't match price, you're going to go out of business. And so you got to figure out a way to either lower your price or pressure someone else to lower their price. And that pressure just gets pushed down the chain and compounded and compounded and compounded. And then at the bottom, you have devastating things.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about consumer demand, because we saw that really get crazy over the past, I don't know, 10, 11 months when COVID started. And we had, people panic shopping. We had crazy shortages of meat and milk in grocery stores. Fresh vegetables were harder and harder to come by at the very beginning of COVID. Just a lot going on. Were there anything in particular that you noticed when kind of all that panic shopping was happening about the grocery food supply chain, or anything that you observed that was of interest during that period of time when everyone was just kind of freaking out?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's the intuitive ones you touched on. I mean, just like everyone went and built their little bomb shelter pantry, stocking up on sourdough. And there was a kind of this national home ec moment where we all sought out, not, and we here is really deceptive, but certain we's sought comfort in kind of this national home ec moment, maybe from boredom, maybe from the fact that it just was an anxiety alleviator. There's all sorts of industry things I could tell you, but I don't know. Like lists came back, and like the industry got very excited. Lists came back. Millennials had ditched the grocery list and we're doing 3 shops a week, sorry. And now we went back to the kind of like 1950s to 70s archetype of a big list, one week massive fill up, and that had implications for online sales, which of course they want people to be more list driven. That adds a lot of efficiency to the system. In general, there was an enormous acceleration of that shift to the online, which I think is not something that COVID caused, but it's something that, you can feel that we've hit a point of no return probably. And that has some consequences in terms of, there's the concept of industry dark stores. Those are stores that are not consumer facing, that are just there to facilitate online orders. And I think, as we've been saying, like with labor being a cost that gets cut, the more consumer facing things are, the less those pressures bear, and the more dark store or non-consumer facing warehousey, the more those pressures are allowed to accelerate. Because the most important thing for the in-store employee was to smile, 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 and be this presence, a guide in your retail world, and that's not happening in a dark store. It's not happening in a warehouse. I think that those two trends have really hit home, and morale in the industry now is real low. A lot of these employees were given hazard pay for the beginning of the pandemic. That was then taken away. They're obviously sick of the rhetoric that they're heroes and getting paid minimum wage. And there's not really any national answer on that, except for everyone to say what I'm saying, which is like, yeah, that's a pretty whack sanctimony. But but there's no immediate changing that at the moment. Maybe $15 minimum wage nationally gets changed, but in a lot of the markets that's already been pushed up.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. Before I open it up to Q&A, is there anything else you want to add about anything that we talked about today or anything we didn't talk about today?
I mean, there's a lot. We didn't need, there's so much more of this book, actually.
I know.
And it's also not a downer book. I don't think. Maybe you would describe it as. It's actually, no. I think it's important it's a warts and all book. And I think it's important to highlight these things because I think they need change. I also think that there are, I call it the dark miracle of the American supermarket because I think there are genuinely miraculous elements to what's going on, and a ton of ingenuity, and also it just gives you a chance to appreciate some of the absurdity of the grocery store trying to feed the billions of us on this planet is trying to do this insane thing, and so the book I think captures some of that absurdity.
Yeah, so for anybody who hasn't read the book, we only scratched the surface, and it's definitely not a negative book. It's really, really powerful and very informative. It actually reminded me a lot of when I started reading Michael Pollan's In Defense of Food all those years ago. And it just had that same kind of muscle of, these are really important things to know about the food industry, and they're mind-blowing. They're absolutely mind-blowing. So I definitely encourage everybody to read it if you haven't read it. There's a handful of really great book reviews out on it too. If you want a little bit more information, just search for that. There's some writers amongst us who have done some great book reviews. And now I want to open it up to the audience. If you have a question, go ahead and unmute, and we'll see how many of these we can get through. Anybody?
I have questions. I'll try to be really brief, but obviously this topic is really, really dense, and there's a whole lot that can accidentally just start coming out. And I'm not prone to brevity. But so first off, thanks for your time. This was really great and informative, and I really look forward to reading your book after my defense in April.
Yes. Each in its turn.
Yeah. So I am. I look really qualitatively and ethnographically at local food production kind of across the spectrum. Backyard gardeners, local farmers, CSA and community garden managers, kind of anybody you can think of that might fall into that category. And try to also interact with the larger scale food producers, but they've been a little bit harder to break through with for, I think, some probably obvious reasons in terms of like perceptions of who I am, etc. But some of the things that are really like coming to bear are how many solutions exist in any locale, wherever you call local, and that a really huge missing piece here are the connections between all the things that already exist. And so I guess I'm really curious about your thoughts on that, what you've seen, and also selfishly, if you can point towards any data, because I am not a very quantitative person, but my research is very much aimed at some of the local policy folks that I've been kind of slowly building connections with and looking at, ways to say, hey, the solutions to boosting local economy and food security through local resources exist. They're here. And it includes large-scale farmers, especially the farmers that are looking to take their existing tools, debt, resources, space, and try to shift towards something that is a little more sustainable in terms of economy and ecologies. So I'm going to stop there. But yeah, I'm curious what your take and insights on some of that are.
Man, it's it's great. I wish I could like blow your mind with like, I don't have neither the quantitative nor really the depth of like quick ideas to throw at you. Unfortunately, what I can say is that I think you're like right on the right track, is that those missing connections between infrastructure that exists on a local level and the local community is where it's at. I think the problem is that they're really hard to make. I mean, you know, a lot of the miracle of the grocery store comes from its scale. And when you start scaling it down, there's a lot of friction that happens that I mean, it's not that it's created friction, it's that you can bear it when you're at scale. And that when you scale it down, it starts to become overwhelming. Which is not to say that that's not the right approach. It is the right approach. It's just that I think it will come down to like really smart people making those connections, which I wish I could point you to. They are out there, but I don't have my finger on the pulse right now. But also I think it is to go to the identity thing and the branding kind of piece that we talked about, working on how you adjust consumer attitudes, right? Because the CSA connections that exist are never going to replicate the grocery store. And that's fine for the CSA consumer, the like 1/5 of 1% or whatnot, that like, and I think that is like the real stat, that like shops through farm markets and CSAs. But that's okay if we can figure out how to frame that in a way that is attractive and is like activating the same ideals that are activated at the grocery store. You know, that's great. It's like, it's a riddle that hasn't been cracked yet, but I think thinking about it in those terms of like the services you're providing, the ideals that you're serving, and I don't think it can just be like Marion Nestle, Michael Pollan ideals. Like if those are the ideals that every CSA participant enacts currently, and it's got that 1/5 of 1%. So it's like, how do we make this into something that is speaking to a bigger population? Sorry, I wish I had a better answer though. It's a great question.
No, I appreciate hearing that though, from kind of a different location and broader perspective. So I think it's actually kind of supportive to hear, because it's encouraging in a way to say this is an avenue to keep pursuing. So thanks, I appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely.
I had a question come through on direct message. It's from Joseph, and he says, in 2009, Hank Gordello wrote in Stuffed that people think that grocery stores are there to feed your families, but stores are there only to sell a product. Do you agree? What are your thoughts?
Well, I guess on a very literal level, that is inarguable. I think that grocery stores are much more demand driven than people give them credit for, again, because of the low margin. There is, you know, the grocery buyer is frantic to figure out what people want, and then give it to them in a way that allows him to meet his end meet. I guess I'm really splitting the difference here. On one hand, I think there are certain objectives in the grocery buyer's mind that dovetail with that analysis directly. For instance, the grocery buyer cares much more about gross margin than he does about taste, quality, or you know, any ethical values of like around feeding your family. So if you can match his gross margin or increase his bottom line in a simply product driven way, you're going to do great. On the other hand, I think it is simplistic to think that the way they're trying to grow their gross margin, like the vast majority of their way, is through serving consumer demand. Yes, they are very open to direct payment. And that's something we didn't talk about at all, but slotting fees and getting products on shelves through direct payment is industry standard. But that'll only take you so far. I mean, like bribery, which is again also very common in the industry, and it makes perfect sense. Why? It only takes you so far, and so they're very demand driven. So I guess there's some truth to it, but I think that's a simplistic simplistic way of thinking about it.
That makes sense. Well, we have 1 minute left. Does anybody else have a final question or thought?
Sure. I'll ask a question.
Okay.
In your, let me shut this off here. That one's off. In your research, did you come across I don't know why this is so long.
Great, you're in a
hydroponic or the local farms that are starting to pop up now?
No, and it's a missing piece. I would, I especially in New York, there's a lot of like small local, either hydroponic or like hyper locally grown products. No, I mean, that's something I would love to get into, but I guess I just don't have anything great to share there, sadly.
A follow-up on that is where I'm from in the Boston area originally. One of the largest supermarket chains there, they own the property of the supermarkets and get rent from all the tenants of the other stores, the dry cleaners and everything else that's there. They keep their prices down. Did you come across that in other parts of the country?
Oh, yes. I mean, the grocery store, in terms of, so we didn't touch on this at all, but the essential model is like, how do we flatten prices as low as possible to keep our margins like razor thin, but then through volume, we'll still make a profit. And so they're looking at any possible way to create a mix, which is like volatility, across the range of assets that they have, that will allow them to lower their prices to create that increase in volume. And so that absolutely extends to real estate, but like, and a lot of other kind of non-intuitive ways of getting, again, like the kind of taxes and fees that they come after manufacturers from buy one get ones, or from free cases of product, or for advertising fees. All of those go into their mix to reduce the margin that they're taking on any individual product. And so yeah, that's like kind of baked into the model of what it means to be a supermarket. It's like, that's how you compete, is by figuring out a way that you can support yourself and then lower everything else down to like the wire, so your competitor can't match those prices.
It's two businesses. I've heard that the furniture store business, an owner of that told me before, we're not in the furniture business, we're in the finance business.
Yeah.
Just get people in the store and then you sell the contract, the financial contract.
Yeah, and real estate is the same, and convenience is the same thing. It's when you're selling all very similar items, location and what you're paying for your rent becomes like the primary attribute in terms of who succeeds.
Oh, Barbara, did you have something to add?
Oh, you're muted.
Oh.
Hi, everybody. I was thinking when you were just speaking about the vertical marketing system that supermarkets try to create, so that they can own just not the land that they're on, but the dairy plant, the perhaps the farms, and of course the logistics of owning the trucking company that then ships all this stuff. And it reminded me of a movie that I used to show my students called The History of Supermarkets on the History Channel. And you can just go to the History Channel and look them up and buy it. But it was fantastic because it showed everything, including the banana ripening, refrigerator. Blew my mind, blew my students' mind. It was just fantastic. And that on top of Modern Meat, if you ever get a chance to see a video called Modern Meat, it shows how hamburgers are made in huge vats where thousands of cows get put into like the muscle meat.
Yeah. Is it a PBS Frontline? Is it not the Modern Meat?
Exactly, yes.
Yeah, I was a teacher for a while. I used to show that to my students.
Oh my God.
Back in the day, yeah.
But this is, your talk is like the capstone of all my, those videos that I saw and what I taught. It's great. Thanks, Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you. No, I love those videos, and I would say one of the great pleasures from this book was that I got to go to a lot of those places, like walking around the Hunts Point Market, or like a lot of these big warehouses, and just seeing those, like the banana ripening, avocado ripening, I call them like madman humidors, because it just the scale and the amount of technology that's brought to bear on them is really impressive.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for sharing, and thanks so much everybody in the audience for sharing too and being a part of this. This is really, really great. I think that we could probably keep talking for another hour, but I just said this was going to be 1 hour, so I won't keep you all any longer. But Benjamin, thank you. This was just incredible, and I hope everybody gets a chance to read The Secret Life of Groceries. And yeah, if you all have any questions or have any other ideas for a talk or just want to get in touch, my email is info@evolve.ag. So feel free to email me. The site is evolve.ag, evolve.ag too. So definitely stay in touch. And yeah, thank you everybody so much. This is really, really incredible.
Hey, thank you. It's such a pleasure. All right, y'all. Be good. Stay safe.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.